The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
It takes me a little while to learn a new dialect of art, to speak comfortably in that dialect. But it's also been a real blessing because by being a bit of a chameleon, I've been able to, doors have opened because I've been able to adapt to the situation.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. As of last week, all 3 books of my Wilderking Trilogy 20th Anniversary Deluxe Hardback Edition have been released into the wild. The Bark of the Bog Owl released in June, and now The Secret of the Swamp King and The Way of the Wilderking are available wherever you buy your books, unless you buy your books at the used bookstore. I earnestly hope there aren't any 20th Anniversary Wilderking books at your used bookstore, or God forbid, your local Goodwill. Anyway, these new editions have gorgeous new covers by Stephen Crotts and exceedingly swampy new interior illustrations by Joe Hox. Joe Hox is my guest on this episode of the Habit Podcast. Joe Hox, it's so great to have you on the Habit Podcast, my new favorite illustrator.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, good to be.
First, a really hard-hitting question. Joe Hox is not your real name. Your real name is Hoxenberger or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, it's Hoxbergen.
Hoxbergen. Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
So why did you change your name? What do you have to hide? That's the big question.
My brother started it. It's my older brother's fault. He had a car in high school that he and his friends spray painted all over, and he wrote his name, but it was going to be too much spray paint if he wrote the whole name. So he wrote Ben Hox on the hood of that car.
Okay.
And I thought, that's pretty good. I like the ring of that.
So that's your professional name is Joe Hox. Because
and it's just
as I've already demonstrated, people get your real name wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, with publishers and art directors, I got kind of tired of misspelling and mispronunciation. So yeah, Joe Hox.
Well, you of course made the illustrations for the new 20th anniversary edition of the Wilderking books. For which I'm exceedingly grateful because you did such an incredible job, and I love what you added to those books. And so we'll get specific here in a little while about the illustrations you did for the Wilderking books. But more broadly, talk to me about. I mean, this may be too broad, so if it is, you can ask me to be more specific. But I'd like to hear you talk about visual storytelling. What's the question? How do you do it?
Oh man, that is broad. Um,
I tell you what, let's do
I-
this. When you specifically that wasn't a fair question, but walk me through the process of going from, a book that you've read to telling parts of that story in visual form.
I so the process is pretty intuitive. I feel like I've done it since I was a little boy. Growing up, I was obsessed with the pictures in books,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's just the channel that I swim in. So when I read a book, I'm definitely I read quite slowly, and I
Mm-hmm.
try to visualize just about everything I can, to make it a movie in my head. Um, so at least with fiction, it just feels like I can't truly enjoy the book unless I go real slow and just um, settle into that world.
Mm.
So that's where it begins.
Yeah. When you talk about visualizing a scene, I wonder if you process as an illustrator. I wonder if you process that differently from other people. One question I've wondered about before is, do you how do you respond to two different situations? One is where an author does a really good job of providing visual cues, and then when an author doesn't do a good job of providing visual cues, is that, I mean, maybe for you that's a delight because you get to do all that yourself. I'm curious what your
Totally different experiences, and I've definitely done both. I prefer when I have the visual cues, at least for novels. It's a different thing when we're talking picture books because so much has to be left unsaid in
yeah.
picture books, and you're having to conjure a lot of those details. Definitely prefer when there's plenty there for me to work with.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be space for creative liberty, and so that itch is almost always going to get scratched. I don't need it to be wide open. Constraints, I think, are a very, very helpful thing. It becomes a scaffolding that you can build on,
Yeah.
and the more well structured the scaffolding is, it's a more secure base for me to add to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
was definitely the case with the Wilderking books. I found that world just really felt solid.
Good. I was hoping it would.
Yeah.
um, well, yeah. So the Wilderking world, there's a lot of swampiness there. That's. I hope that. I mean, one of the things that always appealed to me about that swampy world is that sort of visual appeal. There's lots of different textures, and maybe some unexpected things. I've always one thing that I've loved about swamps is it's a place where two different worlds come together. Right, the dry land. It's not dry land, but it's also not a lake. It's this thing where two things come together, and I'd always wished I had the technical skill to draw that world, and I was really grateful that you did. And I tell me, you, I guess you did a little bit of research, a little swampy research to be able to do
Yeah.
those
So,
pictures.
yes, I would say more than any other project I've worked on, the Wilderking series really stood out as one that required me to do a lot of visual research. So, not getting into like the technical how does Spanish moss grow, but just what does it look like? What are the textures there in the swamp? And I grew up and am still located in southern Iowa, so the Ichihuli is pretty far away from me, and so I had to learn a lot. Unlike the cover designer Stephen Crotts, who has spent a lot of time out in that space.
Yeah.
And that was a joy. I loved learning about it. And I was really struck early on when we were first discussing my illustrating this series. You referred to trees, but not in a general sense, but as, like Tupelo gum trees and longleaf pines and palmetto and Spanish moss and gopher tortoises and water moccasins and alligator garhead for a little satchel on Dobro's as part of his costume, and so many specific things that just show how these characters are really a product of their environment. They're interacting with, they're not just impacting their environment or moving through their environment, but they have a relationship with it. And so because that played such a big part, I had to do a lot of visual, looking up what are the shapes of these things and textures and colors. And even though it was black and white, I was you got to just really get into all that, dig in deep.
Well, I one of the reasons I knew early on that you were just right for this project is the extent to which your visuals showed that you understood that idea of these people being a product of their environment. I like the way you put it. They're not just impacting their environment, but they're a product of their environment, which was, a big thing of the way I wrote the Fiji folks is there are certain things they can know and certain things they can't know about how the world works. And even even the similes they might use, they can't say, I don't know. They can't compare something to the sound of a fire engine. I mean, that's obvious, but they can only use things that can be found in a swamp or they could trade for. And that was a big part of the writing of the story, but it was also a big part of the visual world that you created, it really felt like you were really simpatico with what I was trying to do. And I was really grateful, for that.
Thank you.
And then you mentioned, the Tupelo gum tree and the cypress trees and the palmetto trees. And, from a writer's perspective, just the sounds of those things, just to be able to list all those things is always a pleasure and carries its own value. Even when a reader doesn't know the difference necessarily between, a saw palmetto and another kind of palm tree or whatever, the language itself, I think, is really it starts to sound swampy, and a loblolly pine, which thankfully grows in the swamp, and and so I loved the fact that your visuals then completed that. Like, even if I don't, as I said, I don't know the difference between a Tupelo tree and a cypress tree, the fact that you drew it differently gives a visual, the sort of visual abundance that matches the verbal abundance. And
I like that.
So I really loved it.
Thank you.
I want to hear you talk about, you have a style that it looks like Joe Hox, and yet different books you do are different. I understand how to talk about that. I feel like I understand how to talk about that more with a with the voice of an author, right? People who write different kind of books, it still sounds like them.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how to talk about that with an illustrator.
Yeah.
Like when I see Andrew Wyeth or NC Wyeth, I should say, illustrations, I know it's NC Wyeth, and yet a pirate pictures are quite different from Robin Hood pictures or from, Mayflower pictures or whatever he's done.
Yeah. I used to get really stressed about that I worried that I didn't have a style, and that by taking on so many varied projects, it would just muddy the waters and I would never have any sort of brand, if you will. And really, there is some truth to that. All of the really established illustrators I know, or many of them, have one specific style that they've become famous for. I think of like Stephen Kellogg. Every one of his books you can pick out in a lineup. Dr. Seuss, and the list goes on. And there have been times where it's been a real pain because it takes me a little while to learn a new dialect of art. To speak comfortably in that dialect. But it's also been a real blessing because by being a bit of a chameleon, I've been able to work on a lot of projects. Doors have opened because I've been able to adapt to the situation. I think I get that from my dad, who's not remotely an artist. I asked him one time in my life to draw a picture, and he drew a horse that I honestly thought it looked like a toilet paper tube. But he is very, very adaptive, and he's just as comfortable in the consistory at church as he is, in the stands at a tractor pull. And he really, I've watched him over the years, and he really changes the way he speaks to suit the people he's with, not in a manipulative way, but just in I think a hospitable way.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something in that came from him, being able to feel the tone of the story and respond to it in a way that honors the story, as opposed to, this is me, and I'm not going to change how I approach the story based on,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I said you have a recognizable style, but then I started thinking about like your mooses and bazookas illustrations, that book by Sam Smith. I guess I wouldn't recognize that as the same illustrator who did the Wilderking stories. But when I look at your website and see your illustrations there, I think, oh, okay, I'm seeing some, I'm seeing a whatever the visual equivalent of a voice is.
Yeah, they fall into a couple different buckets that I have them categorized on my website: the painterly, the sketchy, and the woodcut style. And each one, my headspace is very different when I'm working in that way. It's just a totally different process working subtractively, like in a woodcut style where you're carving away from the ink block, versus additively where you're drawing or painting or working in layers. And each one of those, I think I had to learn. The sketchy one is probably the one that comes most naturally. And and that's why the Wilderking project and the Mooses with Bazookas projects were such a thrill to work on over the last year, because it just both felt so natural. I'd love to do more of that.
Yeah. I'd love for you to do a little more, some more Warren stuff, but we better hold off on any discussions about
no announcements right now.
That's right. Yeah, you've mentioned that you grew up on a farm in Iowa. You mentioned you have a dad who doesn't do art. did you, is there a story about you and your sort of, how do you get from farm boy, you say your dad's not an artist. It doesn't mean he doesn't appreciate art. I don't know if he appreciates it or not. Yeah. But you're sort of gone along. You've traveled a distance from the kind of way you grew up.
Yeah,
still working with your hands, but in a different way.
My parents sold the farm, but they didn't sell it to any of their kids. We all went in a different way, and I'm so grateful that they were so gracious and encouraging for us to just follow our individual callings. They never made any of us feel pressured to take over the farm, even though Dad loves the farm and he loves that land, but he sold it because he saw that we were all moving in other directions. So I for sure felt nurtured and cared for growing up. My mom is the creative one. She's been a graphic designer for decades.
Okay.
So
it wasn't just a complete out of the left field.
No, not an anomaly. Although I have a daughter that's good at dance, and that is an anomaly. Because I have all left feet. But yeah, my mom was a graphic designer. She was always she could speak the language of art really well. And so even, to this day, in fact, just this morning, I sent her off an illustration I'd made to get her feedback on. So she's been a piece of my artist community. There's not much of that in Southern Iowa, but she's been a good sounding board over the years. And, growing up on the farm, we were all, I wouldn't say required because that implies that there's almost a choice. It was just life to do a ton of farm work. There wasn't, you wouldn't think to not do it. And so there was certainly a passage of time where I was starting to develop some autonomy as a pre-adult, where I thought, this is, the farm life was the worst gulag that I could live on. But it, I guess memories get kind of rosy as you get older.
Yeah.
And so now I see it with a lot of, charity, I guess. But back then it was a lot of toil, a lot of hard work. And I did feel, some amount of resentment that I couldn't be. I knew I wanted to be an artist from first grade on, so I felt some amount of resentment that I would have to spend my time doing this, whatever it is, raking hay or whatever.
Feeding America is what I call it.
Feeding America, as opposed to feeding my imagination. So but now I draw on it. I tap into, when I'm drawing a scene outdoors, I have an encyclopedia of textures and the way the light moves across the land. I can tap into that because I was at one with the land for so many years. So it was a gift, but it was just, not my favorite at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned that your mom is part of your artist community. How do you, or maybe do you have creative community that you dwell in, whether that's online or local?
That's been a real challenge. I'm so thankful for the ability to go online and find other like-minded folks. The Rabbit Room has been a big part of that, honestly. They have a group called Artist and Persand, and every Wednesday somebody goes on and, asks everybody what are you working on right now? And it's just been a really cool and simple way to just kind of build bridges with other creatives, especially Christian creatives.
Yeah. By the way, in what platform? Like, you're on Facebook doing this? How
that one's on Facebook, and then, but also I'm fairly active on Instagram, and it's been a great way to kind of to go back and see a history of someone's posts and network and build bridges there. I'd say a good 80% of my work has come through those connections.
Really?
And so that's been really valuable. But then I also, locally, of course, I have my mom, who's a good sounding board. And then my own family. My wife is a writer. She writes devotionals, Kate Hox. And we didn't know this when we got married, but she, deep down, I think she does have a really good mind of an art director. She never had any sort of art background, but she is really good at articulating how something is going to be perceived by the viewer. She has a lot of empathy, and she can put herself in the role of somebody who's seeing that book for the first time. And so it's near constant where I'm asking her to take a look at this thing that I've worked on. And then also being able to bounce stuff off of my 4 kids. My sons are younger, my daughters are older, and my sons are often hanging on me while I'm trying to illustrate. And they'll sit on the floor and draw the same thing that I'm drawing, but they're just not getting paid as well. And or maybe they are.
They are. One thing that it seems to me, illustration is always collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are artists who I'm sure are lonely geniuses, and you have to be an unlonely genius in terms of the way you do things. And I mean, I learned a lot about collaboration just from the illustrations that you did for the Wilderking books, and I guess I'm now segueing into I'd like to talk a little bit about an illustration that we kind of collaborated on, just to provide some insights to anybody who's interested.
Sure.
And I've got one, and you may have one that you're interested in talking about, but
sure.
But there's an illustration in the Bog Owl where our people are bringing an alligator on in a wagon into the town of Tambluff. And that picture had a few iterations.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. I would say that was the hardest illustration in the whole series. And it was early on. And it was challenging. In part, it was challenging because there's a lot of specific information about directions of different things in relation to each other in the book. And so I actually, for that one, in preparing for the actual work of illustrating, I had to do some prep work of reading the text, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 times for that specific passage, and then creating a map that showed where the different landmarks are. The castle is on a bluff overlooking the river, but then the castle is separated from the town by a little tributary that becomes kind of a moat. And then there's the city is square and has high walls around the outside, and then a drawbridge connects over the moat between the city and the castle. I wanted to somehow include all that, and the giant alligator in a cage pulled by oxen, and the characters on horses, and the village. And at first it was very overwhelming to try to figure out. I thought it was a crucial piece of the story, but how to depict it in a way where the main thing is the main thing. And so I did a map. I did a 3D rendering on a free program called Tinkercad, where I lay out my more challenging compositions. So I made a little 3-dimensional city and castle, and then I played around with camera views in that 3D rendering to decide just the right cinematic point of view for that scene. Looking down over the shoulders of the characters. So all this was before I started, the actual illustration, laying the groundwork. But then, so after that, I did all the illustration. Used a lot of references because it's that angle on horses is very rare. So I actually found drone footage of wild horses running on YouTube.
Really?
And I took screenshots of that to use as kind of references for just the right angle of the horse.
Yeah.
So then,
I didn't know all this.
Then I illustrated. I submitted the illustration, and I think the general response was everything's favorable, moving in the right direction, but there's a few things that need to be addressed. And one of those was the diversity of the characters. That was important. And that's probably because I live in Southern Iowa and everybody around me is white, but it didn't even occur to me to make a diverse cast of characters, but I think it does add some richness to the whole story to have a multi-colored bunch of people.
Yeah.
So that was one, and that was easy to address. Another one was changing the buildings slightly. I had them very medieval, wattle and daub construction, and you suggested that it have a few more notes of frontier in it, and so that was pretty easy too. It was just taking some of that stucco look and changing it into like clapboard.
Yeah.
The other thing was the moat. From that camera angle, the moat is kind of down in a low spot between the far distant castle and the city.
Yeah.
And so including that moat just really became a real challenge. And so in the end, we kind of managed to just kind of make a space where that drawbridge is open to suggest that maybe there's something hiding down in there. But
the one just from our back and forth on that particular illustration, it was a reminder to me that it's been 20 years since I wrote these things, and there were things I just forgotten. So I was like, well, this, I said there was something I said that wasn't right about the way you had done it, and then you kind of directed me to the paragraph where you were right. And I've had this I've been doing a few podcast episodes and been people asking me about what my intentions were here or there. I'm like, you know what? That was 20 years ago. I don't know. I don't remember. And so that was a funny moment for me whenever you said, no, I got this from you. You're the one who wrote it this way. And it was also a reminder that you can get a little loosey-goosey as a writer with the visuals when you don't have to actually model it visually the way you have to.
Yeah. All the information was right there in the text to build this. So,
well, that particular illustration, just that last thing you mentioned, that I when I asked you, can we get a little bit of frontier Old West? Because the whole thing is kind of a mashup of medieval on the one hand and frontiersy plus swampy, on the other. Kind of like when Florida was still, there was a Florida frontier, when there was an opera house in San Francisco, there was a sort of a frontiersy thing still going on in Florida, and so that's a great example of the opportunity for the illustration to bring out something that I think probably a lot of readers would miss, because you hear a castle and you go straight to medieval wattle and daub, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated the fact that we could have some images that would remind the reader, no, there's a little bit of a, kind of some Wild West going on here too.
Yeah.
And even, you and I were on the Withy Wendell podcast, and this came up there, but I'll mention it again. When Pete Peterson, who, read these books 20 years ago, somehow he got in his head that Fiji folks were elves or something like that, some sort of supernatural creature, which is part of the joke, because the civilizers have never actually seen Fijis, and so they have all kinds of crazy ideas about what they might be. But as you knew, and Pete didn't, they kind of just look like Florida man. They have mullets and they don't wear their shirts. And, and so when he saw those illustrations, he's like, oh, now it sort of really reshaped Pete's way of seeing this, even though Pete was, the editor for this round. And,
I think there is real value in some of the illustrations being helping the reader to understand what's happening, especially when there's things that, like, if you're just reading it at a nice steady pace, you might miss, but it would tell the story just a little more if you had that visual reference, just to educate the viewer a little more. I had that with my youngest son. He was 6 at the time I was illustrating this, and I read him the books, and in the third book there's the clay wastes, and he was so confused about the idea of erosion. He didn't understand that concept, and the sinking canyons, how they're just continually being changing, shifting sand, and so being able to make an illustration of that, even just in the moment, for him to kind of help him understand, that it can be really valuable to just, and then now the reader at a glance can, look at that illustration and see, oh, the water's washing away the dirt.
The clay waste, the sinking canyons, it's based on the Providence Canyon in Georgia, and
oh, cool.
I had which is just it's a gully that just got a lot bigger. I mean, it still looks like a gully. It's just the biggest gully I've ever seen, unless you count the Grand Canyon as a gully, which I guess in a way it is. But I'd never actually seen Providence Canyon until the last year. I went down there finally, and I was happy to see that your pictures looked about right. So
all right. Yeah.
But no, I love that the erosion is not the most self-evident concept to the target audience for these books. Let's say, right? There's some, 6 is a tad young for. He's on very much on the young end of the. Yes. I would say maybe he's outside the target at age 6. But even the people who are kind of in the, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, whatever. I really am grateful for your illustrations to make these things apparent, because those natural processes are really important to this book. Erosion. I don't want to say too much about how important erosion is in book 3, but it's an important thing, and the plume birds in book 2, and there's lots of natural processes that are important to the story, and those are you made those a lot more accessible to young readers. I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, you bet. The other thing that I haven't ever experienced with this project was where, as an illustrator, I had the chance to respond to the text in such a way that you changed the text just a bit.
That's right.
Do you remember the raft?
Oh yeah.
So the raft was 40 pine logs, I think. And so what I did was I didn't know anything about these rafts of logs that people would ride down was it the Mississippi River?
Well, I mean,
or
sometimes,
wherever.
but the ones I knew were the Altamaha River in Georgia, Altamaha and Okmulgee and Oconee.
And so I did some research into the typical size of these pine logs that people would cut down for these rafts. And so I took that and I put it in my 3D modeling program and took the number of logs, and it turned out to be huge.
Yeah.
This massive flotilla of logs. And so I illustrated based on that, and the character just looked like an ant on this massive platform, and the river had to be huge enough to accommodate that. And so I submitted that, and everybody was like, "Oh, that's got to change."
Yeah.
But it could only change if we reduce the number of logs. And so anyway,
that's right. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. And yeah, that was embarrassing for me. I didn't. So I guess I put it out of my mind. But
sorry.
Yeah, I don't. That's not the kind of thing I would have researched, and apparently I did not research that properly. And but that picture you drew was just ridiculous because you were trying to make it match up with the. It still looks huge in the book. It
does.
And I think what you drew was 20 logs instead of 40.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Well, we have to tell the story about why book 2 has an extra illustration, which I know we told on the Withy Wendell podcast, but this is my podcast. We're going to tell it on mine. And then, so this is the next to last topic.
Okay.
Yeah, when you turned in your 10, because you were contracted to do 10 illustrations per book, you turned in your 10 illustrations for book 2. They were fantastic. And then you just,
thank you.
Just a little throwaway. You said, "Oh, here's this other thing that I started doing. Too bad I didn't have space for this." And it was the people, the Fiji folks crying during the sad ballad that Dobro sings during the Fiji sing in whatever chapter that is in book 2. And I said, "We've got to have this picture in the book. This is just too good." You had not completed it, but you had done enough of it. I said, I really want this. And I didn't tell you this part. I composed an email that first said, "I'll pay you." And then I backspaced.
No, it ended up better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I decided I'm not going to, let's try something else before I try to round up the money to pay for this. And instead I said, I'll name some wee features after your kids. And so that was, when you said I changed the text based on your illustration, I thought you were talking about that, because we changed in book 2, some features are renamed according to the names of your 4 kids. I didn't actually know there were 4 kids. I didn't know I was going to have to find 4 features to rename but it wasn't. It was well worth it. So
it was. Oh man, I was so happy with that arrangement. As a fan of the book, and then I know how. So my oldest daughter, I read those books to her probably 8 or 9 years ago, and they became her favorite books ever.
She's a reader of Taste and Decency.
Well, I think she just related to all the Fiji stuff, and she doesn't know yet. It's going to be a surprise. So I'm not going to let her listen to this podcast.
Well, the books that I sent you should arrive before the podcast comes out. So
all right, perfect.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question. I normally ask who are the writers that make you want to write, but in your case, we're just going to say who gets you motivated to pick up a pen or a 3D modeling, whatever, and start making illustrations besides a contract.
Besides making a living. Good question. I would say the more I've seen AI images start to dominate the web, the more I want to push back against stuff that looks artificial and shiny. And so even digitally painting, I got my start illustrating the Good News for Little Hearts books for New Growth Press. And some of my earlier work for that feels a little too smooth and rendered. Interesting. And so I'm really resistant to the AI stuff. And so just over the last couple of years, I've re-fallen in love with some of the old illustrators who are working just mostly with pencil line, like Bill Peet, Garth Williams, who did Charlotte's Web and The Little House on the Prairie.
Tell me what I would know from Bill Peet.
Oh, let's see. Bill Peet, he has a lion book. He was a Disney artist for quite a while, and then went out on his own. Maybe in the 50s and 60s.
That era.
That era. Yeah. Very, very playful, fun style.
I love Garth Williams so much. Those Charlotte's Web, just the sort of the furriness of the pig in those Garth Williams illustrations is so. It's like, here's a person who's paid attention to what pigs actually look like.
Yes.
Instead of the stylized pig Porky Pig has his appeal, but that's not what pigs look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very resistant to formulaic stuff. So his work in particular, Garth Williams, he was a keen observer of people and postures and textures of different things. Well,
I love. I don't know too much about art, but I know I love that exercise that so many art teachers do, where they require you to actually actually look at a chair or a shoe or a tree. And we have our symbols for for how to draw a tree, but they have nothing. They're not. They communicate this is supposed to be a tree, but they don't actually communicate what a tree looks like.
Absolutely.
And so Garth Williams is a great example of, as you said, somebody who really paid attention to what the world looked like.
Yes, absolutely. Chris Van Allsburg is another one with the Polar Express and Jumanji. His stuff is a lot more polished and refined, but there's a real richness there. Sean Tan is another contemporary who's combining a lot of traditional drawing media, but then also taking it in very imaginative directions. So he's another one. And then my good old pal Joe Sutphin. I love his work, and I follow his work pretty closely. I worked really closely with him on the Watership Down graphic novel. He did all the drawing, and I did most of the coloring. He did some of the coloring too. Okay. And he's one who, it's one thing to admire someone's work, but another thing to work alongside them and just feel that he's just a man of integrity, just a caring fella. Yeah. So he was wonderful to work with, and so because of that experience, I see his work in an even better light. It's like going to a musician's concert. When you see it in the flesh, somehow it's richer and better. You know where their heart is. So
yeah. Well, Joe Hox, I have so much to be thankful for about your work. I have loved the Wilderking books for 20 years, and I love them more because of what you've done for them. So thank you. And
thank you.
Thanks for being here. And let's keep it up. Why don't we?
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right.
Sign me up.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.